a look at the cultural and historical significance of water in Hawaii. Participating in this morning's opening discussion, I'll call them one by one as they can join us here on the stage. Kamana Maikalani Beamer, Professor of Hui Aina Momona Program from UH Manoa. Aloha. We also have, returning to the stage, Kiana Frank. A Professor Director of Kahuliau Center for Excellence in Native Hawaiian Law, William S. Richardson School of Law at UH Manoa, Kapua Ala Sproat. And the panel will be moderated by Kamuela Inos, as we introduced him earlier, setting the tone for this afternoon's session, Director, Office of Indigenous Knowledge and Innovation, UH System. Aloha, Kamuela. And as a quick note to everyone, the moderators of each of the panels that you'll be seeing throughout the day have set some time aside. They'll take a few questions from the audience at the end of their discussion. Microphones are set up. I think they are near the bottom of the center aisles. Oh, there we go. So feel free at the very end, if you have ninau, if you have questions, to share them, and they will answer that to the best of their ability.
Yeah, aloha. So aloha mai, aloha mai pākahia pau. Again, just wanted to thank all of you for being present today. And especially if you haven't had a chance to hear the presentation of Kiana or to be present for some of the conversations we're having, it's deeply appreciated that you are listening with an open mind. I think this is a really important conversation. And I appreciate Vice President Vasilis Ramos for allowing this to happen, because these are conversations that often take place in different conference halls. And that they can be actually in the same space authentically is really important, and it's really appreciated. So in thinking about the arc of this panel, in other conversations, especially as an undergrad in Hawaiian studies myself, I always loved learning about the pre-contact stuff. And then after that, I was like, oh God, you gotta learn this happened and that happened. But I think that arc is really important because it's the arc of resilience. We can't talk about water resilience unless we talk about community resilience and continuity of practice. So this panel today is the second part of what will end in the contemporary conversations that Dr. Kugawa or Kugawa Viviani will talk about after, is the histories of how we got from that brilliant space of dancing mo'o and an anthropomorphized landscape that understood very clearly the microlife, the microbiomes that lived in our spaces, to where we are now. But more importantly, where we need to be going together in as much as we can in this time. And what will that look like authentically? So I would like to start with introductions, quick introductions of our guests. You heard their job titles, and I feel awkward when I hear my job title too, because what I believe is they're all members of community. And I would like to have them introduce themselves by their community, where they were born, their families, and maybe how their birth of where they're from and their family allow them to be working in the spaces they are now with their relationship with water. So I'll start and we'll go in that direction.
Mahalo. Aloha mai kākou. Oh, I'm making funny noises. Sorry, I don't know if my mic's gonna like my lei, but we'll see if they can get along. So it's such an honor to be here with colleagues and friends and heroes. And I was raised in Kalihivai, Kauai, which is literally and figuratively at the edge of the fresh water, right near the ocean, where the meheo and the keavai winds really bless our area. And since we're talking about fresh water, actually, keavai is so important. Because that's actually, so for the scientists in the room, that's fog drip. But for us, that's just the night wind that comes down the valley in Kalihivai. And so on my mom's side of the family, we have lived in Kalihivai for about 6 generations now. And before that, I was in Halele'a or Napali. And I come from a family of fishers and farmers. My grandfather, William Boy Napuhala Ohaena Akana, was a konahiki, so he was a resource manager for various things in our Makai areas, for Akule in Kalihivai, for Amma in Kalihivai and Kahili, for He'e from Hanapai to Wanini. And so we grew up gathering or raising a lot of the food that ended up on our dinner tables. And my grandpa, he only went to school to Western school, to the 4th grade, but he was the most brilliant marine biologist that I have ever met. And I know a ton of really amazing scientists, so I think that says a lot. But the biocultural knowledge that we have particular to place, I think is really, really instructive. But Kalihivai was where I was raised, it's where I live now. And I think it's my playground, but it's also my classroom. And I think that was very formative for me in my relationship to an understanding and scholarship and teaching about Vai. I think when we were growing up, people used to tease us as a kuaina branch of the family, and it wasn't a compliment back then. Like now, everybody wants to be kuaina, but back then it was not so complimentary. But I'm super honored to have been raised with that knowledge, because I think it was so fundamental for me. And so when I was growing up, it was a time of great transition in our community, where the plantations kind of stopped growing cane and started planting houses. And so my family was very, very engaged in ensuring that a Kanaka perspective was brought to bear on all the changes that they were proposing for our community. And I think the face of the North Shore would be very different if it wasn't for the work that my parents and my extended ohana did. But during that time, from when I was small, I mean, I joke that I grew up holding sign, but we never had attorneys who were able to represent us on these issues. So we would end up in contested case hearing, or so administrative trials, or before the planning commission, and the community was representing themselves. So in the 4th grade, I decided that I wanted to go into law to have a hand in protecting the areas that I lived in and loved. And so my upbringing and my knowledge of this place really, and really my desire to try to protect it and make sure that some semblance of what it was could remain for my kids is what really drove me to where I am today. So mahalo, kamu.
You heard a little bit of my story. I'm from Kailua. My ohana is from Kailua. My parents grew up there. They met there. My grandparents on my dad's side are from the back of Maunawili. My mom's side from Kainalu on Molokai. And I was really lucky to be raised a lot by my great-grandmother, who lived on the edge of Kauai Nui. And that is how I got my exposure to this space. And I was the only mo'opuna, the only grandchild that she told these mo'olelo to, specifically the mo'olelo of the lepo'aia, the edible mud of Kauai Nui. She said it tasted so ono. It was like the sweetest, freshest poi you could ever imagine. Color me intrigued. Imagine me, a little 6-year-old. Oh, my grandma told me the only way you could find this mud is you had to be absolutely quiet. So imagine me, a little 6-year-old with my bucket and shovel, silently tasting a shit ton of mud. The black mud, the green mud, the red mud, the gray mud, all the muds that were not delicious. But it was in this process of play and exploration to find that ono, lepo, aia, that really engaged me in the process of kilo and brought me and grounded me in this space. And as I got older, I was fortunate enough to engage with kumu and kupuna of Kailua to teach me even more about these mo'olelo. Pawahi even heard this story of the lepo aia, She was stoked on it. The newspapers retell of her going with like to Kauai Nui to find this mud. They had to dive 8 feet deep, and they collected this bright pink, haupia-like consistency mud that was so ono, and they had a big paina to feed all of the people of Waimanalo, Kailua, He'eia, Kaneohe. Party times, right? Had I known it was bright pink, maybe I wouldn't be a microbiologist today. But it's these practices of restoring and rebuilding our connection to these mo'olelo, and through organizations like Ka'uluakalana, who are stewarding our heiau and our water resources and trying to bring back abundance. I'm connecting my dad to these stories, places, and names of the waters that shaped and grew him. And I'm connecting my siblings and my grandparents back to these places. And so for me, my entry into science was fueled by these stories of place and my connection to place. And because of that, it has allowed that connection to be reestablished within my ohana.
Okay, Melina mai kelohi ka'aina ya kako pakahia pau. Aloha mai, I'm Kamana Mai Kalani Beamer. I'm the most unlikely PhD you'll meet, so thankful to be here with you folks. Worked alongside some of the great hydrologists here, so want to aloha Roy and others for all your commitment on the commission. Kaleo, our Kanaka deputy, and many of the people here that have been advocating. Hey, I see Mike Buck up there. Aloha, Mike. Advocating for our Hawaii. So my ohana, my dad's side comes from Kipu'upu'u, mostly from Waimea. We've been there about 5-6 generations. My mom's side is actually from Kauai and Maui, Kalaheo, Makawao. And so I kind of grew up in between, but I think what solidified my story is just luck. I was the only grandchild, I am the only grandchild of an amazing woman. Her name was Nona Kapua Ilohia Manona Kalani Deshe Beamer. And since my parents were split, I spent a lot of time with my tutu. Out on Aina, she had great networks and friends and people, and just traveling around our islands, learning mele and stories of place, and seeing the changes over time. My great-great-grandmother, Helen Deshe Beamer, she used to travel around Hawaii Island, and as a gift to people, she would compose a song. So, Nakuhivi Elima is a song that she wrote traveling from Hilo to Kona, looking up at these beautiful mountains on our island. And she would present them as gifts, to people and to place. And these mele would really recall intimate details of the Aina and the Akua and the peoples associated with these places. So I kind of grew up with this attachment to wanting to learn about place and resources and people and these relationships that we've had, over generations. I also had a crazy uncle. He used to take me up Mauka. He wasn't a guy that would make it into this room or even want to be here, to be frank. Didn't hold jobs for long, but he was a Mauka guy, and he taught me to jump off cliffs, jackknife, suicide, and to play in streams. And I remember realizing that there's something about water that brings out the best in people. My uncle that struggled in a lot of ways, he's no longer here with us. When he was Mauka and we were grabbing hihivai and whatever, taking invasive prawns, he was the most rich, happy, wealthy uncle I could have. And so there's something about water that brings out the best in us. And in my small time, in my work, I've just tried to help other people to recognize and touch that.
Mahalo. And thank you all for sharing your history of yourself and water. Water isn't something as Hawaiians you can talk to outside of our context of who we are as people and our relationship to geography and relationship to landscape. And sometimes if we're not given that context to talk about that and we just talk about water directly, it's like touching a live wire that we don't have grounding for. So this gives us a space, hopefully, to humanize this conversation and allow us to have clarity on what we would do moving forward. So thank you for that opening. And with that shared, like given your roles in the university system, maybe could you share a little bit about what is that as you bridge your peers who are in different capacities, whether they're in history or law or in science, and your community? And what are some of the things that you would like this audience to know about what that work looks like? And what are some of the central tenets to doing it well?
Well, you know, the thing about Hawaii is that connection to people and place. And Kiana did an amazing keynote showing us the ways our ancestors, you know, related to and almost deified these natural systems and cycles because they provided life. You know, here in Hawaii, the political systems that have used and controlled our way influence the outcomes that we have. So my work as a professor split between School of Law and School of Hawaiian Knowledge, a lot of it sort of looks into, you know, the history of politics and land tenure and water use in Hawaii, which is one that is filled with, you know, historical injustice, the overthrow. You can't talk about water without talking about, you know, the emptying of streams, radical shifts in basically the modes of production, the ways that people were able to feed and sustain themselves were altered radically when we dried out streams and no longer, we didn't, but when they were done, people were no longer to farm and to cultivate. And so a part of my work is, you know, dealing with that legacy of historical injustice and but also, you know, uplifting our ancestral practices to be able to cultivate and to restore. And you know, we're making some strides there. I go in aloha Mike because we had a lot of good and difficult conversations on East Maui and the Wai'eha, but we restored over, I think it was 43 streams in 8 years. So there's a lot of work to be done, but recognizing that historical past and the truth of what our community has faced. I don't think we should talk about Hawaii without thinking about justice. And what is justice? Dr. West says, justice is love in a public sphere. That's what justice is. And so we got to think about Hawaii and justice.
So I see my role as a professor really more about showing our communities and our students that science is a part of our culture. It's inherently a part of our culture. It's not distinct, right? That all of our ancestral practices, our mo'olelo, our ka'au, our oli, are encoded with deep scientific knowledge of our spaces. And that is ingrained in the courses that I teach and the way that I do my research. And I see myself as a translator between, you know, the academy and the community to put the contemporary science that we're doing into the rigorous translation of what we can understand for community and what that means for practice, and vice versa, translating the rigor of our community observations and knowing of these spaces back into the academy. You know, PDFs and written papers are what we're supposed to create as producers of knowledge in the university, but that knowledge is not what is accessible to the people, right? I translate in dance form often, if you didn't pick up on that, because it aligns with our methods our ancestral methods of teaching and education through hula, through kinesthetics, through association and memory. So, I don't know, I see my role as a translator within the university and always trying to push that to equalize our knowledge systems and elevate them so that we can integrate them and best apply them for innovation.
I feel like in a lot of ways, the work that I do at Kahuliao, so I have the great privilege of being the director of our Native Hawaiian Law Center, and I feel like Kamana and Kiana and I all do the same things in different disciplines. I mean, basically, we are seekers of justice, and we are translators of the arcane language of our specific disciplines into media that's recognizable and that's usable and that can be operationalized by our communities. And so, part of what I do is I teach doctrinal classes in Native Hawaiian law, but really so much of that, like Kamana and Kiana have explained, is about reframing and is in grounding ourselves in culture and context and place and practice, because that's really the foundation. Part of what our panel is supposed to talk about is the cultural and historical significance of water, and I feel like Kiana explained that perfectly already, and we have that context now. Right, and now we have to sort of build on that and look at where we go next. And a big part of that is justice, because in the history of Hawaii, in looking at freshwater of Hawaii, the history of freshwater in Hawaii, it's an incredibly complicated one. That's very stark and contains tremendous legacies of colonialism that we need to address. And so part of the way that I do that in my role at Kahuliao is in scholarship and in teaching, but especially through our clinical work. And so we have live client clinics, like our Native Hawaiian Rights Clinic and our Environmental Law Clinic, where we give students the opportunity to practicing law, so that we can provide direct legal services to communities with the greatest needs. And we can help to translate all of these things that are really straightforward for the students. It's like, okay, this is basic statutory interpretation. But for Kanaka, from Honokohau or from many other places, that knowledge and that information is incredibly important. And so for us, I view our work at the university, especially given our charge as being a Native Hawaiian place of learning and an indigenous serving institution, as really bringing the law to life on the ground and in our communities.
Thank you. And I really appreciate that we started with the arc of where you're from and why you do the work. And then now that you're in the university, and this is a university conference, what is the continuity of how you were raised and the things you learn is expressing itself in your current role? Maybe the next question I would put out there is, what are some of the things you're seeing in your current capacity relative to the conversation about conservation and setting up the panel after? That would be really important for this audience to think about and hold on for today. Yeah. Just so the role of the university and an indigenous-centered university, looking at some key points to think about. And at any order. Y'all can pull one time, no chance.
So sorry, Kama, what are we seeing in?
Yeah, in your current space of work, because it's really going to be about conservation. Right. Given the arc of where you were and what you see yourself as doing, what are some things that we can be shared with this group around that intention of that term conservation, given the legacy that Kiana has lifted and the history that Kamana has spoken to? What does it mean to move forward with those things that you'd like to share to this group?
I keep having to start. So Kalamai, we start not so good and we end brilliant every time. So we're working our way up here. But a lot of my recent work in publications, I've been really interested wai. The fact that our ancestors thought about wealth as water, and what does that really help us to understand is a whole number of things. Without wai, you cannot ola. Water's capacity to bring life, and even in the modern context, controls our economic systems, right? And we know, especially here on our islands, given what was a completely avoidable crisis in Red Hill, it can have long and lasting effects if we don't care for our resources. So our kupuna's insight around waiwai and that the economic system was supposed to be like water. It was supposed to flow. And so the resources that come on the aina flow down and are provided for people, and they even set up political systems and structures, these things called kalai aina, where every generation, the leading chiefs would have to redistribute the resources. And this was to mimic the water cycle. And so I've been involved in work on circular economies and some recent kind of publications in that area where I think the insights of our ancestors around wai are really, really valuable and can inform our future. I think the other part is, when you deify a natural system, when you have these pilina relationships, like Kapua is saying, her family stood up for her place, we also have to recognize we have to cultivate courage. Yeah. There are so many problems that we have in our islands today that were avoidable. If more people would have stood up and spoke on Red Hill when we knew there was an impending crisis, we probably would not be where we are today. And so we need to mitigate and fix these problems with research, with science, with all the tools available. And we also have to recognize we need to cultivate courage to stop things when we know they're not right before they get this bad. So, mahalo.
Mahalo, Commander.
As we talk about conservation, I think it's really important to always come back to this idea of pilina and relationships, right? Because as we study our water, geochemists, you're studying the relationship between water and rock. You're studying the relationship, the pilina between water and the atmosphere, right? Hydrologists are studying that relationship between all the different types of geologies and the water. And so as we understand those relationships, it also brings up concepts of ea. Ea is a really complex, layered term. Sovereignty. It also means oxygenation, breath, right? And as we want to restore and conserve and rebuild our natural practices, we also need to restore the ea of our water. We need to oxygenate. That's the purpose of an awai, is to oxygenate and flow that water that is coming out of a rock to feed our plants and nourish our local i'a. And with that ea of water, as we bring that oxygenation and that breath, we're also bringing agency over our water systems and our places, and having that relationship helps us to better steward and conserve for the future, right? And when we think about conservation and ea and pilina, we're thinking generationally, not just 20 years, but 800 years into the future, right? To ensure that these systems that we conserve and rebuild are lasting, and they will provide for all of our communities and our people.
I think what I would just add to build upon what Kamana and Kiana have already shared is that culture is science. I think within the conservation community, especially here in Hawaii, especially the people working on vai, and I've been so privileged to be a part of that community for a couple decades now. There's the culture box, and then there's the science box. So my message that I want to get out to everyone is that the culture box is the science box. And I'm not a scientist, but that's really vitally important for us to realize, right? Here in Hawaii, we are so incredibly lucky because we have a millennia of biocultural knowledge that is especially vital now, given the climate impacts and our new climate reality. If we want to be able to stay here into the future, we have to look back to the practices that allowed us to sustain a population that was not a lot less than the number of people that we have now, but at that time we were completely self-sufficient. Kamana talks about how before the arrival of Europeans, there were more people on every single island here, except for Oahu, but at that time we were completely self-sufficient. We can get back to that place if we utilize the cultural knowledge that we have. We are not where we are now by accident. I think a lot of and this is what's going to require the courage that Kamana mentioned earlier, right? We're not where we are by accident. I think a great example is Maui Komohana, and we have a lot of people in the audience from Maui Komohana today, so I want to give them all a big shout out. I want to mahalo Kaleo and all of the folks at the Water Commission who had the courage to designate Maui Komohana as both a ground and a surface water management area in August. This is something that was a scientific decision that became political because people were concerned about the implication of that work. But the reason that Maui Komohana had to be designated, this additional layer of protection had to be imposed to protect the water resources there, is because a century ago, people took all of the water from Maui Komohana. Lahaina was known as the Venice of the Pacific. And for those of you who know West Maui or Maui Komohana today, you don't often think of it of the Venice of the Pacific because it's not. Because development tunnels and horizontal wells and things were put in that took all the water from these communities to a different place and use it to subsidize agriculture. So the legacy that we are living with now, that this community is living with now in Maui Komohana, is totally different. But because of our climate impacts, we have to have the courage to be able to move forward by looking to the past, to the principles, and restoring the practices that will enable us to continue to thrive. Mahalo.
Yeah, no, and as you're talking, I really appreciate the depth and complexity of what we're speaking about today and your specific roles. And I would wonder too, and we also have time for questions, and I don't like didactic talking at. I think we have such a powerful and robust audience that at some point, if you're also thinking about questions as well to ask our panel, that would be really important to start to formulate now to put out. But forecasting forward, like what are some of the, and I think we're going a little bit off script, but I think we've ran through our questions.
We're not totally off script.
But like forecasting forward, what are some of the inherent challenges that you see that maybe people aren't aware of that they should be thinking about? And then what are some of the solution sets inherent you think of using these systems can begin to solve for? Thinking into the next 50 years. And you can take as much time as you want to answer this. But that kind of forecasting and blending these systems in an applied space for collective abundance.
Let me start again. The first mohai. So we have a collective project, a book coming out. It's called Waiwai, Water and the Future of Hawaii. And actually, there's several authors of different chapters in this book. I see Ernie in the back. Ernie's got a chapter in there. And so we actually asked in this book, the thing about water is we understand it's incredibly, unfortunately, it is the unifier. It is a thing we all need and connects. But unfortunately, sort of because of our boundaries and systems we've set up intellectually, it's incredibly siloed in how we manage water. You talk to the legal side, the hydrological side, cultural side, the political side, and sometimes those don't come together. And so this book project is really trying to be an example of what we need for the future of water in Hawaii, and to try to have that siloed perspectives all in one place. But I think some of the highlights for me are we understand we're in the midst of not just political crises, but with climate crises. One thing that's very clear is, we're getting more and less rain. We're getting more in intensity. So it's not like the old days of my youth where it rained almost every night up Mauka, and daytime would get sunny. We're getting periods of no rain and choke rain. Halele'a side on Kauai, these massive floods that we've had. So what does that mean, given but the forest has largely been deforested over the last 250 years. So we don't have steady, amounts of water that can seep into the aquifer. It's flowing out in rapid phases. So we're really gonna have to figure out what we do with so-called stormwater. What Kiana presented on Aihea Kauai Akane, there is no stormwater versus wastewater versus drinking water. It's just one water. It's one resource, and we have to better manage it as a collective. So we have to break down the engineered silos of how we manage water systems. Think about stormwater for a second. For a while, you actually got an A+ by channelizing a stream, protecting private property, getting all the petroleum runoff from the streets out onto the reefs as quickly as possible. And that was actually success. That still is success, right? And so we have to break down the silos and recognize the entire system that water is operating in our islands, and really rethink that and reshape that together in urban environments, in rural settings. And we have to rely, I think, on the principles on these islands that made life thrive for the only time Hawaii was anything close to sustainable, was these ancestral values and principles around our islands. So uplift the community and their work, and break down the silos in how we manage our water systems.
So if I can recap it, I think this is an important, because I think this is the important take-homes. This is the ha'ina, that in a future where water is going to be either very scarce or very abundant, the role of ancestral societies de-siloing of water. Like water wasn't treated in fragmented ways. It was the core of both our scientific pedagogy, our spiritual understanding of the universe, as well as our governance. And is a water-centered economy and a water-centered society that didn't bifurcate it. It's going to ask us to de-silo and reintegrate not just the thinking of different manifestations of water, but different groups together who normally may not talk are going to be asked to speak more. And government is also going to have to be seen as community, as government too, right? And that kind of rethinking and restructuring are kind of the projected 50-year call to action. Kamana, is that an appropriate way?
Yeah, I think that's going to be critical for the future of water, in our islands. But it's an incredible opportunity, to rethink urban settings and how we do agriculture, with less water, more efficiently, the right kinds of crops that relate to the ecosystems that Kiana talked about. And I think it's just an incredible opportunity to build off of our ancestral practices to solve the crises that we all face. Again, water is the thing that's unifying us, and we're facing many of the same crises together, regardless of our political or ecological perspectives. There's rapid changes that we have to adapt to. And I think we are, Kaleo, the commission, we have structures in place that can help us, but I still think we got to cultivate the courage. Sometimes we don't act on things that we need to.
Thank you. Come on. Anyone, you can go the same order, or you guys can switch them up.
I'll just add one thing really quick, because I've been in hearing what Kaman is saying, I totally agree. I think the values are foundational to our moving forward. And that's one thing that we have to remember and thinking about here in Hawaii in particular, right? Especially for all of the decision makers in the room, and I see you and know who you are now. In Hawaii, we have a constitutional public trust, right? And that's critical. That means that we have specific provisions in our constitution that says water is a public trust. Our natural and cultural resources are not owned, they're not commodities. They're held by stewards for the benefit of present and future generations. So that means that we all have kuleana. And kuleana, yes, in the legal sense, you have a fiduciary duty, decision makers, that you have to malama this resource, right? But what I also wanted to underscore is that here in Hawaii, the public trust is different. In a lot of places, it's established by common law, by cases that are decided. Here, it's constitutional and it's grounded in Native Hawaiian custom and tradition. So the public trust in Hawaii is grounded in values like aloha aina. And so that means that all decision makers should be kind of like Ernie Lau, who's sitting in the back with Aaron Kawata, who, when they see an issue like Red Hill, do have the courage, like Kamana is saying, to speak truth to power. And people like Ernie who seriously awamo their kuleana. and make these difficult decisions that are not politically popular, but were incredibly important. And Ernie Lau has been talking about Red Hill for like a decade. He was totally right. Nobody ever wants to be right in catastrophic crises like this, right? You want to be like, oh yeah, I saw it coming, I could have told. We don't want to be right. We want to be preventative. We want to be proactive. We want to be, that's how our ancestors were, and I think that Aloha Aina is a key to doing that. And so what I really want to say to the decision makers in the room, and actually to everybody, is to really, in order to move forward, we have to look back and we have to really embrace these values and practices, not just because it's a cool part of our history, which it also is, but also because it's a background principle of the law, and because for the decision makers in particular, you have a kuleana to really do that for the future.
So is there things that you're seeing in your professional work too that we should, on top of that, calling us to be brave and acknowledging that our water systems ancestrally became the basis of public law? Is there any other things you think is really critical? Because I think you're acknowledging Kamana's pauku, but for you specifically, that you're seeing in the next 50 years that maybe can ask all of us to think about approaching?
Well, I think for me that the big part of that is really looking back to the core values like Aloha Aina. I really believe that Aloha Aina is the future. I mean, it's everything. It's what allowed us to thrive here for a millennia. And I think it has the potential to enable us to thrive again. But in order to do that, we have to have a fundamental reorganizing and redistribution of resources. And we have to rethink and reshape how we're managing, because we haven't been managing proactively. We've been responsive in lots of ways, and that's not going to cut it anymore in the new climate reality that we have. So that's why I do think it really takes courage and it takes action, and that we all have a part to play.
Thank you. Kiana, next 50 years, let's put our AR goggles and sci-fi.
Or 800, up to you.
I'm going as many wide as you like.
Kamana and Kapua so beautifully set these foundations that are, higher than the level at which I work at.
I don't believe you.
Of management, and it's about holistic thinking, right? One of our challenges is that lands are parceled parallel to the coast, not perpendicular. And so when we look to examples of ahupua'a, or land ownership from mountain to sea, kind of within a full watershed, we see more ownership and agency over the control of water. But for most of us in the community, we don't have control over the entities that are utilizing the water above us, whether they're taking and not restoring, or whether they're affecting the quality. And our systems of management, channelizations, right, is enhancing all of the threats, especially the microbial threats that we now face. We all know if it's brown, turn around, right? And as we are experiencing these increased rainfalls, we're flushing all of the stuff, the eha from the environment into our water systems that is then influencing the productivities of our coasts, right? And so in order to regain that balance, there needs to be that relationship between the scientists and the place and the people of the place, acknowledging the akua of that place. All of our mo'olelo go back to that. In the mo'olelo of the Makalei, it talks about a time when Kauai Nui was overgrown with invasive limu. And Ahiki, even though he had the best of intentions to bring community together to clean out this limu, he didn't acknowledge the akua, and he overlooked things that he couldn't see, and therefore there was problems downstream. And so in order to restore that balance, we have to restore the connections to all of those elements of our spaces, running all the way back up to the source, and being mindful of how our practices and land management influences the quality, especially of our waters that flows downstream.
So we get to the point where I think we're about closing. 10 o'clock, right?
Oh, wow. That was...
Or we were getting at, well, not closing, but getting to the part where I'd like to open up for conversations from the audience. And I think there's mics over there and over there. But I want to hold the space that this is probably maybe for some of you in the audience looking at demographic, you've heard this before. And for others, this is the first time you're hearing this. And I really appreciate that we are allowed to have this kind of conversation between us. And if it's comfortable, then we're probably doing it wrong. But the role of a university is not to feel comfortable. The role of a university is to ask authentic questions with rigor. And all of these are UH faculty that have been doing their work with rigor. And maybe before I would turn it over to questions, what advice would you give to someone who's maybe feeling uncomfortable in the audience as an invitation to a shared reality of how we have to live together? And maybe that's a last minute, but I want to make sure we're setting up a thoughtful response.
No be bashful, no be shame. Just do it.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I would say makahana ka ike. The knowing's in the doing, and so if things are uncomfortable, then you don't know and you're not familiar with the information or the knowledge or the terms or the values that we've been talking about, then find out about it and embrace it, because it's the way forward.
And huli kalima ilalo.
Yeah.
Come with your hands turned down.
Yeah. You know, this discomfort can bring about innovation and change, and we're in a crisis, so it's not a time for feeling comfortable. Yeah, it's a time to work together.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'd embrace all of you, implore all of us that, so much of the challenges we see now is because our inclination to other, and that maybe today is the first step of not othering people who may not share an opinion with you. But I love that in Hawaiian, there's no word for enemy. Mm-hmm. I learned that in one of my first Hawaiian language classes. Enemy. The fact that we had to create the word enemy means that, and I thought about that, in the choice of words, there's a prefix called hoa, H-O-A, that entails intimacy. We know hoa pili is intimate through friendship, hoa aloha is intimate through love, hoa hanau is intimacy through birth. But then I saw there was hoa paio, intimate through struggle. And why I thought about that is that on islands, you cannot other people. We went to war with people that we knew their genealogies. We understood that when we othered them and we made them something else, we dehumanized them. And I don't know about you, I don't think I've seen anything good come out of the dehumanization. And I think the opportunity for the university to be humanizing these conversations, but not removing rigor, not removing accountability, and creating a space, I think is really what the hope for these 3 successive panels can do. For the Hawaiian Studies folks, if you've never been to OVPRI, and the OVPRI folks have never been to Hawaiian Studies, we can look at each other as others and act in that way. We can also look at each other as fellow human beings and absolutely not agree with each other, but still find the space to discourse. And I was thinking on the right end, one of my favorite musicians is a African, Fela. I forget his last name, but he's an African musician, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, but he has this wonderful song, Water Has No Enemy. And I just always love that song, like nobody hates water. And if we can find this space for discourse and disagreement, because we partnership to struggle today as a starting point, I really feel appreciative. So if we can open it up for questions, if people, I don't know how we want to do it, Eric. We have, how much time we got? 10, 15? Yeah, I know we started a little. We have some time, and maybe if more questions, we can break early to prep for the next. I think we went without a break on this, so people probably got to use a bathroom too. Yeah. But yeah, if anyone wants to have questions, there's a mic there, or you can, I don't know if you can yell them, I can hear them. Or we go in order, like 1, 2, and 3.
My question is in relation to, because the issue of water resiliency and because of the decades of colonization of our island, how do we then move forward with a reconciliation of colonization, if not necessarily decolonization? And then how do we then move forward with policies that then address equity, right? Because there is generational issues.
Yep.
From on Earth. Okay. And how do we ensure that as we move forward, that equity translates into more resilient system for all the people on our island, versus what may be perceived as, for lack of a better term, the lucky few or the lucky man.
Wants to start with that one?
Because Poor Kamana has started every single one, so I'll take a swing at that and I welcome other Manawa as well. I think that's an excellent question and an important one that we really need to be grappling with, not just in this forum, but I think, in general, if we want to be able to continue to thrive in these islands for another millennia. What I would say, and to be clear, my context and a lot of the work and scholarship that I have done has been largely in law and policy. So I think that already in terms, for example, the constitutional provisions that we have and with the water code, that we are actually already have an adaptive framework that not just makes space for, but mandates justice and restoration in many different capacities with respect to our BITE. Interim stream flow standards, looking at the proactive protection of ground and surface water. The issue, I think, has been what Kamana identified earlier, and one being of courage, that many of the decision makers didn't follow the law, to be frank, and didn't do what the scientific and didn't operationalize the scientific and cultural frameworks that are already in place to achieve justice. I think the frameworks in and of themselves are not enough, and because of the way that they have operated inefficiently, that more needs to be done. But I would start by saying that I think we have a good starting point. What we really need is a courage and the willingness of decision makers, like our Deputy Director, Kaleo Manuel, who made perhaps for some the unpopular decision of supporting the Commission's decision to designate Maui Komohana, but one that needed to be done given the climate impacts, which is gonna result in the reappropriation of the way water has been used in Maui Komohana for the last 100 years. That's long overdue. The reality of that situation is that the community members, that everybody is gonna have to undergo a very rigorous permitting process, which is gonna be difficult and time consuming and expensive. And so I think some of the ways that we can look at to build resilience and ensure that the process is going to work and be a net positive is that we need more investment and more resources, I think, for the community and the resources in particular. Part of the work that my clinic does is provide direct legal services to folks like in Maui Komohana so that they don't have to hire attorneys to be able to do their permitting. We have a great process where the students receive training and have the opportunity, the transformational opportunity to be able to work with Kuaina and these amazing community members, and the community members get great help. So we need more models like that. I think in lots of different spheres, not just law, because we need that also in science, we need that also in lots of different ways. But I think that's one step and part of how I would begin it.
Mahalo. Yeah, come on.
Yeah, I think there's like a supra higher level question around, issues of sovereignty and justice that does sort of flow into almost all decision making around Hawaii, and we see it with our community when there are contentious issues. So I do think, decision makers have to kind of recognize that. I don't have the magic elixir for that, but I think it starts with being able to hear and tell the truth, because our community understands the reality of the situation that we live in.
I didn't grow up accessing the Hawaiian language newspapers. I didn't grow up knowing there was no treaty of annexation. I knew very little even about the Oath Book. But today, as a professor, I can tell you, there's 2 million acres, and I can say where those acres are.
So I also,
Yeah. Is there, come on, check your mic.
I get cut off sometimes. So,
That's not an accident. It was turned off.
I can stand up and say it louder, but so hopefully I was just trying to say that I didn't grow up understanding a lot of our history and the truths of Hawaii. I had to find them out on my own in different ways. But my students today are operating from a whole different knowledge base. And I'm really confident that they're going to want to see different outcomes in terms of the future of Hawaii when it comes to issues of justice, like you're talking about, and reconciliation. So, but I do think with water, Kapua's right. We've already stormed that front in many ways with the Hawaii State Constitution and the Con of 1978. We established the public trust doctrine, and it has enabled us to restore streams, and when we restored in East Maui, total flow of streams, one of the most amazing things I saw was when the community said, oh my gosh, the water's back. I can teach my family to go kalo again. And then the commission had the humility to say, we're gonna learn from the kupa, the community that actually understands what it's going to look like when these streams are restored, and the native stream biota. And then actually when we went out and did stream surveys, it turned out that stream restoration created so much ecological abundance and biodiversity. It was comparable to a coral reef. And that was through the public trust mechanism. So I think we do have some, but there's this larger super question that I think we got to figure out.
The next question, sorry, did you want to, I saw there and a there, and I can't remember the order. Oh yeah, there and then we had one on that side. Yeah, okay. So you want?
So I'm wondering about the problem of carrying capacity for ecological events.
Sorry, you just a little bit harder.
Carrying capacity.
I'm wondering about the problem of carrying capacity, whether one may have too many people for a particular area. And I'm wondering if there are any historical examples of Papua as having exceeded the carrying capacity of a particular area for consuming more water than was provided. And what tools do they have?
Yeah.
What is the use?
Yeah. Ooh, can I take this? Yeah. Awesome. No. Wow. Awesome question. So the question, my mic's back on. So sovereignty and justice, first of all. No, so everybody heard that. The question was on carrying capacity. And ancestrally, are there examples of ahupua'a that may be, overextended and they had to innovate and adapt? Amazing question. And actually, that there is archaeological evidence. A good friend of mine has worked on some papers on this, that when our ancestors migrated, came on va'a, and there's successive waves, there is some evidence that the nearshore fishery had a period of decline because more and more people were coming. We were having babies, making plenty fun. And the nearshore environment actually started to lose biomass. And that actually corresponds with the innovation of creating lokoia. And that's when our leadership were like, okay, we gotta fix this. And we started to develop lokoia and fish pond systems. And actually, it's one of the few examples in conservation. Jack Kittinger has a paper on this, a few examples of conservation where you see a decline and then an actual increase. And so lokoia at least according to this line of logic, is sort of an innovation that addressed that carrying capacity issue. So really, really cool question. Yeah. And we're used to fish stocks going this way, right? So we don't have too many graphs where they curve back up. So it's a pretty significant paper.
And the other part of the question was, what are the lessons going forward?
What are the lessons? Yes, so the lessons are, they were able to innovate, our ancestors, because of, that pilina that Kiana had talked about, and that connection to place and resource. And I mean, pretty amazing to detect that on the scale without the modern tools and technologies that we have today, to think and be able to assess that the nearshore marine environment is experiencing some type of decline, and then innovate. So I think part of that is about that rooted knowledge of place, ancestral knowledge of people that are connected to resources. This is something we're missing out tremendously in management. The reason our system worked before is because there was enough top-down, but there was so much bottom-up. When you had a population that knew that were invested, related to the Aveoveo spawning season, and it's different on Molokai than it is in Kea'au on Hawaii Island, but the people know, and you set your resource management policies to be aligned with that spawning seasons and cycles, it's going to be way more abundant. No single board on Oahu can do that and be that kind of adaptive, right? So I think that's the lesson, is we have to try to empower community-based knowledge in our decision making.
We'll do our last question, and then we'll poll.
Mahalo for being here. I came to support my friend who doesn't speak till the afternoon, but this is great. So my question is, going back to Aloha Aina and the water, how do you feel about the surf park that's coming up in Ewa that will initially draw 1.7 million gallons of drinking water, and then every 5 to 10 years do the same thing? Because culturally, yes, surfing is within our culture, but we're getting word that what was going to be open to the public to use this surf park is now going to start being more for whoever visits the resort only. But going back to this water crisis, in the future, I see that my keiki will no longer be here, because where's all our water going? Our water is going to the largest water park in the world on an island, who is going through a water crisis. And Akorni says that he's very concerned about the water within the next 20 years or so. So there might not even be 50 years from now. So, but I guess mahalo for everybody who's here, and Water Commission as well. What's your take on it, and what can we as a community, because I've tried to go to those meetings, and they always meet it during work time. So at the time when I was working, I wasn't allowed to meet. And being that the public trust is also the Hawaiian community, many of the community that agreed to this water park was not Hawaiian. So where can we go from here that
Mahalo.
You want to take that?
No, you can.
Oh, I'll start, and I'll just be super clear that I haven't been tracking the permitting and the processing for the surf park closely. I've seen some things in the news, but I'm not totally up on it. What I'll also share is that in my spare time, I volunteer as the vice chair of the City and County of Honolulu Board of Water Supply. But I'm not speaking here today in that capacity. But I would say, but given the information that I've learned, I have serious concerns, not with respect to the water park in particular, but largely with respect to Red Hill. Given the fundamental crisis that we are facing on Oahu because of Red Hill, I'm not sure I mean, I think we're going to have to be even more careful about the management of our drinking water on a going forward basis. Given the contamination that's occurred, and a lot of people think of it in the terms of the last year or but really it's like the last 80 years. And if you have questions, you should ask Ernie or Erwin, who are sitting in the back row here, because they're really the experts on these issues from the BWS perspective. There are other folks who have been working on it. But we're already seeing a significant, we can't use several of the wells that are provided, that have historically provided drinking water. So we're already down a significant amount, including a well that was the most productive source of drinking water in that area. And so we're already down. In addition to that, for folks who've been following the news, there's a lot of concerns about the Navy's drinking water system or the military's drinking water system. So there's an additional 93,000 people that are gonna need water, and the drinking water that's required for that complex can be up to 20 million gallons a day. So given just what we're facing right now, I think we have to be incredibly mindful about how we use our precious drinking water on a going forward basis. We have reclaimed water that we could use. Here in Hawaii, we have been so spoiled that we have amazing drinking water, and people don't like to think of reclaimed. Or on other islands, on Maui in particular, they have a really good ordinance where they're being more mindful of recycling. But we're gonna have to only use our drinking water, our clean water that we have for drinking. And we're gonna have to be very careful about what we do for everything else. So that doesn't really answer your question, except to put it in the larger context of what we're really facing right now. And just given that larger context, I don't know that we have water for that. So more research and thought needs to be done. Ernie's raising his hand in the back.
Thank you.
So Ernie's happy to talk to anyone who has questions about the water park. You can approach him during the break.
So I'm going to recap, because I think we almost power. Yes, come on, Kalamai, please do. Kalamai, Kalamai. Aloha.
There's opportunity for me to share my mama. There's a lot of things that's going on in Maui, and the November ballot, there will be charter amendment that's placed on the ballot for November to basically start water authority for Maui, mainly the east side, a community-based water authority, and just trying to get the gist of where we're going and whether or not it would benefit the general community about placing a water authority on the east side. Eventually it's going to be a Maui Nui thing, Molokai Lanai as well. Just maybe some feedback from you guys on the ups and downs, the benefits and the non-benefits, the cautions and precautions, because we are kind of looking at it as basically a positive opportunity to get generational knowledge people in this water authority. I just want maybe some feedback on whether or not pros and cons about it, because we're really interested in how this thing may lay out for our future generations tomorrow.
Mahalo.
You want to try? I can go after.
I'll start.
Okay.
Aloha, Uncle Keamoku and Auntie Uilani. I didn't even see you folks sitting there. You know what I think about this. Now, was everybody able to hear the question? Yes? Okay. So in general, I'll say that I do support the idea of locally based resource management, that I think it's really important. I think the point that Kamana made earlier, I have so much aloha for the Water Commission and the work that it does, but we don't have staff on the neighbor islands, and that's critical to be able to address these issues and to be responsive, not even getting to the importance of like the cultural based knowledge. When you're actually a practitioner of that place, your intimacy, your pilina, and your ability to manage is completely different than if you're trying to manage remotely or from another island. So I'll say that out of the gate that I do really support it. I looked at the initial drafting of the language in the initiative that was put forward by Council Member Senesi, and I guess I do have some concerns about whether or not the funding and other mechanisms are going to be sufficient, because I think if this is going to happen, I want it to succeed. And I worry that there isn't, just having volunteered with BWS and looking at all of what it takes to make that initiative work, I think there needs to be a lot more institutional and other support. I don't want it to be just you folks and the folks who really care. Like out there, this cannot be funded on grant money. There has to be more institutional support in order for it to be successful. I also do worry that given the interlocking regulatory mechanisms that are already in place, there aren't provisions in the language that's being placed on the ballot now for things like how it's going to interact with designation in Maui Komohana or with the water code and other areas. And so coming at it from a perspective of wanting the community to succeed and wanting the resources to be the best managed, I think that some additional tweaks could make it even better. I know that just the way the process works in Maui Nui, that once the language is approved, that's what's on the ballot. Perhaps some of those changes can be implemented as this moves forward, but I see the potential, but I also have concerns that that the initiative isn't being sufficiently set up for success because there isn't sufficient administrative, financial, and other support. But I don't know if folks have other manao.
Yeah, I kako'o. I think, in general, finding mechanisms for our community to be able to have authority over common resources is probably a good thing. But all of Kapua's reservations, I think, are stuff that you would have to look into the nitty-gritty details. But I want to aloha, Maui Nui. I feel like you folks have been incredibly innovative in alohaʻing issues and in managing your resources and really inspiring, in your county council, inspiring other places across Hawaii. So, yeah.
That was plenty. And I appreciate mahalo, Keomuku, for asking, and for all of you for being present. I want to acknowledge my dad, who's probably sleeping, Eric Enos, one of the founders of Ka'ala Farms, who brought water back down in Waianae Valley, that I can do this work. But just to set up the next conversation with Aurora, we started with Kiana's arc of who we are, and that talking about our stuff isn't a performance, that this is treated with intention and rigor and as science, and then to talk about the histories in ways that we can be honest and we can tell our truths from our perspectives, not necessarily as an indictment in everybody in the room, but when you don't let people talk, they will get bad. And if we give them the right way to talk with rigor and intention towards and collected outcome, that we have this space here. And I really appreciate all of our speakers to be brave and to come up and and to be present today. And we hope that heading into Aurora's conversation, that you feel that there's an invitation. I was always taught that there's always an invitation to rigor and accountability, that when we embrace it, we refine our humanity. So I just appreciate you all for allowing us, and thank you for this space. So we're going to close our part. And I'm wondering, are we transitioning over? So mahalo everybody for listening, and mahalo nui to our guests, and mahalo kako.